This is Tom Fox. I would like to welcome you to a special 5-part podcast series on navigating CFIUS risks with business intelligence, a podcast series sponsored by K2 Intelligence Financial Integrity Network. In this podcast series, I visit with Him Das and David Holly to discuss the risks involved in the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S. and how best navigate them. David Holly, a co-lead of the CFIUS advisory practice at K2 Financial Intelligence Integrity Network, has more than 25 years of global investigations, business intelligence, corporate governance, and regulatory compliance consulting experience. He draws on decades of private sector experience to provide pragmatic advice that integrates his investigative skill set and financial expertise with cutting-edge technologies. Him Das has over 15 years of strategic experience in crafting innovative legal and policy solutions to domestic and global challenges involving critical U.S. economic and national security assets. He assists and supports all aspects of K2 Intelligence FIN's work, including risk assessments, training, and the development of and review of new services, products, platforms, and technologies. In this podcast series, we will take a look at an overview of CFIUS, then consider navigating the CFIUS process by proactive engagement and compliance solutions, consider CFIUS sanctions and export control compliance frameworks, CFIUS and cyber risk and access control, and conclude with effective monitoring and compliance officer solutions for CFIUS. This series is one that I know you will enjoy. It is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network, and once again sponsored by the K2 Intelligence Financial Integrity Network. In this episode 2, I visit with Him Das on navigating the CFIUS process by proactive engagement.
And thanks so much for having me here and placing a spotlight on some of the CFIUS compliance considerations.
And could you start with giving us your views on what you think CFIUS may be looking for from an organization that is considering engaging in a transaction that would be covered by the law?
Yeah, that's a great question. On a previous episode, I think my counterpart Dave Hawley spoke a little bit about some of the substantive things that CFIUS is looking for in terms of identifying threats and vulnerabilities to U.S. national security and determining whether or not to approve or mitigate a transaction. I'd really like to speak to a little bit about what CFIUS is looking for through the process and how parties engage with CFIUS as they consider a transaction and as they sort of begin engaging with CFIUS in terms of seeking CFIUS approval of a transaction as well. I think first of all, CFIUS is an iterative process between the parties to the transaction and CFIUS. It's essentially a two-way conversation between the CFIUS agencies and the parties to the transaction. CFIUS is looking to engage in a dialogue with the parties. They're trying to accomplish a couple of key functions. First of all, they're trying to seek information or clarification regarding information that's submitted to CFIUS. They will try to sort through the filing and assess what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are that are presented by the transaction. But in doing so, they're also going to want to understand the underlying business rationale for a transaction, and a number of questions that they might ask through the process may be intended to try to get at that. Second of all, they're going to try to think through and discuss with the parties what the national security considerations are, and to try to develop a term sheet for a mitigation agreement if they have concerns with the transactions. Often, because national security issues are classified security-related issues, the parties will have to do a little bit of guesswork in terms of trying to understand exactly what the national security considerations are and to think through how to appropriately develop a mitigation element that meets the business needs. And the third piece is that CFIUS is going to be negotiating mitigation terms with the parties that are going to be designed to resolve whatever the national security concerns are. And they will want to engage in a dialogue with the parties to see if there are ways to mitigate those national security concerns in a way that are consistent with business interests. This can be a somewhat complicated process. of engagement, and that's why I think it's very important for parties to a transaction to just have effective advisors to be able to understand what the CFIUS process is, to understand what the issues are that CFIUS considers, and to also understand what the dynamics are within the CFIUS interagency process. There are a number of different agencies that are participating in the CFIUS process, and they all have different views and equities, and so it's important to understand that dynamic. I think that overall, that engagement is going to help ensure that the responses to CFIUS in terms of questions that they might ask or proposals that they might make are targeted at the right concerns and the appropriate concerns, and also advance both the parties' interest in getting the deal done and advancing the U.S. national security interests as well, which is important to all of us. A second point that I just wanted to raise is that I think that the CFIUS process will go much more smoothly if the parties are well prepared and provide clear and thorough responses up front and are prepared to quickly respond to questions when CFIUS does ask questions throughout the CFIUS process. The CFIUS regulations provide specific information that's required for a declaration or a voluntary filing with CFIUS, and that includes a broad range of information from basic business information, the nature of the business, whether or not they're involved in critical or sensitive technologies or sensitive personal data, whether or not they have government contracts, as Dave mentioned in a prior episode. There are many other elements that they will ask initially and that are prescribed in the regulations. But they will often just have follow-up questions because some of the questions may raise new questions or additional questions. And that's why it's just important to be very clear in terms of what the answers might be, maybe be prepared to provide organizational charts or technical information that's presented in a very clear manner. The third element in terms of what CFIUS is going to be looking for is that parties just need to be in a good position to be able to address CFIUS proposals for mitigation. They need to understand exactly how the business operates and how the business might be tailored in a way that might address some of the national security considerations. So it's important to, as you're going through the investment deal or the M&A deal, to just go through some advanced due diligence to both understand what the investments are, what the transaction is, and what the business is, to think through how to best modify the transaction in a way that might be able to effectively and quickly mitigate some of the concerns that CFIUS might have. The other piece is that it's very important to think through whether or not it might be worthwhile proactively implementing compliance frameworks with respect to some of the issues that Dave talked about previously, with respect to sanctions, export controls, access, cybersecurity protocols, that might provide CFIUS with greater comfort and trust regarding some of the national security considerations. Again, it's key to just proactively consider what CFIUS might have in terms of concerns and be willing to work with CFIUS in terms of addressing and tailoring mitigation, because ultimately they have the ability to block a transaction. The last thing I wanted to mention just in this point is that it's just worth noting that CFIUS views completed transactions, that is transactions that have gone through and been consummated, very differently from pending transactions. Often, if a completed transaction raises concerns, CFIUS is going to and can potentially require a number of very difficult mitigation conditions that either might frustrate the business purpose of the transaction or may be very costly. They might require an unwinding of the transaction, and if the transaction's unwound, they could require a monitor or compliance officer to ensure that the transaction is completely unwound. And ultimately, this can be incredibly costly, require the dedication of significant resources as well. So that's just an important thing to think about before completing a transaction, is whether or not there might be CFIUS issues.
Tim, how do you even begin a filing under this process?
Well, I mean, I think that CFIUS process should start at a very early stage. I think that investors and the target U.S. business should start thinking about the CFIUS considerations as they're conceiving of the investment or the M&A process. I mean, this point is incredibly key. It's just never too early to start thinking about what the national security dimensions are, because it might have an impact on the contours and the structure of the transaction and the manner in which the parties approach CFIUS. So I think that from a CFIUS compliance perspective, it starts at the point where you start talking about a transaction or an investment. In certain cases, for example, a complex transaction or one that's likely to raise significant national security sensitivities, or it might come from a sensitive foreign country, the parties should start thinking about whether or not to engage with CFIUS at a very early stage, even before the final terms of the deals are developed, just to be able to brief CFIUS in order to be able to gauge its reactions and to engage in a dialogue with CFIUS so that they start becoming comfortable with the transaction, with the nature of the transaction, with the parties, and with the business motivation for the transaction. So this is well before there's even a CFIUS filing, as the parties are thinking through the transaction. As you start getting nearer to completing the contours of the transaction, you may want to think about whether or not to make a voluntary declaration, which is a short form declaration that doesn't require the same information or the extensive information that's required for a longer CFIUS filing or a notice in CFIUS terms. The voluntary declaration process is a shorter process. It's a 30-day process, and it's one in which CFIUS may clear the transaction or may indicate that further review is required. But it's a shorter process. It requires less information, and it may be appropriate for a transaction that is a less complicated transaction, or if you're a repeat investor from a country in which the United States has strong positive relationships with, it may be possible to get your transaction cleared in a shorter process. There may be other transactions in which a mandatory declaration is required, and these are transactions in which there's a substantial investment by a foreign government, or in which there is an investment in a company that is engaged in transactions that involve critical technologies, that is, sensitive, dual-use critical technologies like semiconductors, avionics, robotics, potentially biotechnology, and others. I think ultimately to be able to assess the right pathway in terms of how to approach CFIUS and to sort of follow the right pathway in terms of a voluntary declaration, a mandatory declaration, or to go through the full 90-day CFIUS process really depends on the parties' understanding of the risks of the transaction, who the parties are, the nature of the U.S. target business, and also just the business necessities, the time frame needed to complete the transaction, because there are different time periods that are required for the type of filing that's made with CFIUS. Ultimately, once the parties have worked out the material elements of the transaction and they're ready to approach CFIUS more formally, they can make a decision on whether to file a declaration or a notice. The CFIUS rules prescribe what information is required for the filing or the declaration. And then, very importantly, the CEO of the companies that are involved or an appropriate senior level official has to provide a certification with potentially significant penalties regarding the accuracy of the transaction. And then once it's submitted, then you begin the process in terms of having a conversation with CFIUS.
So, Hem, what compliance frameworks would you suggest a company have in place or create to get through the process?
That's a really good question. I think that it really depends on the nature of the transaction and the parties involved in the transaction. And in particular, again, an understanding of what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what the risks are that are involved. Where there is a business there are a number of different circumstances and situations, and I can just run through a few of them fairly quickly. I think that where there's a business that is engaged in business with sanctioned countries or sanctioned jurisdictions, or there is high concentration of sanctioned actors. For example, there are a large number of transnational criminal organizations, or the potential for terrorist financing issues or terrorism. It's important to have a robust sanctions compliance framework that meets the standards set forth by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, and to have a culture of compliance around sanctions. CFIUS is going to potentially look to whether or not the company and the foreign investor have a strong compliance framework, whether or not they've engaged with sanctions countries, and whether or not they've engaged in violations of sanctions rules. Where a company is engaged in sensitive technologies that are subject potentially to export controls that are administered by the Department of Commerce. Those are dual-use technologies that have military purposes and commercial purposes, or sensitive technologies that have primarily military-related uses. CFIUS will look to whether or not there's been a full vetting of the types of technologies that the U.S. company uses, the types of technologies that the foreign investor might be using, and whether or not the companies have undertaken a full export control review of those technologies to see if they're subject to export controls, and whether or not there are policies and procedures with respect to the evaluation of policies and procedures that are involved in the transaction. If there's sensitive data or access to critical infrastructure, I think that CFIUS will often look to whether or not there are strong and effective cyber risk policies and procedures or access controls with respect to any sensitive personal data, whether or not there are access controls with respect to sensitive technology, that is physical access controls, and how those are implemented, whether there's an effective culture of compliance around those controls as well. CFIUS finally is potentially going to require governance frameworks, as I think Dave mentioned in a prior episode as well, that will be able to provide an effective oversight mechanism around the implementation of any of the policies and procedures or mitigation agreements or CFIUS requirements with respect to transactions. And these include, proxy boards or arrangements. It may include independent board members that may be charged with evaluating and ensuring that the companies are complying with the CFIUS mitigation agreement, or monitoring and effectively addressing any national security controls or considerations. And they might require special compliance officers or monitors, again, so that CFIUS is comfortable with the transaction and the administration of the mitigation agreement as well. And again, as Dave mentioned, I think one of the things that CFIUS will start looking to more and more is that there is effective training that's done to board members, to senior management, as well as to staff at all levels, so that everybody understands their responsibilities. Companies are going to need to consider whether or not these compliance frameworks should be put in place in advance of entering the CFIUS process to provide confidence to the CFIUS agencies that there is a strong compliance framework, and to also engage with CFIUS through the mitigation and negotiation process to try to develop more tailored approaches as well.
Unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but I wanted to, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope our listeners will join us tomorrow, where we consider CFIUS and export control compliance frameworks, financial crimes, risk, and compliance. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of our 5-part series on navigating CFIUS risks with business intelligence. I hope you will join us again for another episode. This 5-part series, sponsored by K2 Intelligence Fin, is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.